When America sneezes, the whole world trembles. No war needed, no pandemic required, just one recession in the U.S., and a wave of countries could collapse in a global domino effect. Currencies devalue, banks shut down, aid dries up, remittances disappear, and economies that were already shaky won't just wobble, they could completely fall apart. From Lebanon to Ghana, from Sri Lanka to Jordan, there are nations surviving on breath. From Washington, and if America stumbles, they won't just trip. They may never get back up again. Lebanon. When a nation lives on remittances and lost trust. In the heart of the Mediterranean, once dubbed the Switzerland of the Middle East, Lebanon is now a faint shadow of itself. The buildings that once symbolized financial prosperity have become sealed fortresses, where banks no longer act as gatekeepers of trust, but as desperate strongholds of a collapsing system. And in that picture, the scariest part is, Lebanon hasn't truly hit rock bottom yet. Since 2019, Lebanon's economy has been sliding deeper into crisis, a deadly mix of poor governance, mounting public debt, rampant corruption, and an increasing dependence on remittances from citizens living abroad, especially from the U.S. While other nations use remittances as a supplemental element in their financial systems, Lebanon has let it become the final breathing tube. Over 6 million residents at home, and a Lebanese diaspora of more than 12 million living in the U.S., Canada, Europe, and the Gulf, have formed a survival ecosystem where money isn't generated internally but sent in monthly, quarterly. A small transfer from a cousin in Boston or an Uber driver in Michigan suddenly becomes the lifeline that keeps an entire family afloat in Beirut. When the domestic economy no longer creates opportunity or real income, those quiet wire transfers become the only source of cash. But what happens if that money flow suddenly disappears? A U.S. economic recession, even just a sneeze in the global system, could be the final blow. Relatives abroad lose their jobs. Income drops. U.S. dollars stop arriving regularly. And more dangerously, there's no one left who can carry the weight for a country that's nearly out of fiscal foundation. When Lebanon's central bank froze withdrawals, when the financial system could no longer hold public trust, people turned back to cash, specifically U.S. dollars. But now, even that currency is threatened by something beyond their control: the future of the American economy. We're not talking theory, but reality. Families who used to survive on $200 to $300 a month from children in Florida or Texas now have to choose between medicine and food. Schools raise tuition fees in dollars, but salaries are paid in the lira, which has lost 90% of its value. The healthcare system, dependent on imported equipment and supplies from Europe and the U.S., can no longer pay its bills. And when shipments of medicine and medical gear requiring upfront foreign currency payments are delayed, the result is lives lost. The situation is even worse with a government that's nearly helpless. No strong enough budget to intervene. No significant foreign reserves to offer relief. No international credibility to borrow or negotiate aid. In the eyes of global institutions, Lebanon is no longer a patient to be treated, but one far past the point of emergency care. In a country where electricity is only available a few hours a day, where college students dream more of leaving the border than rebuilding their homeland, people no longer place hope in internal forces. They look outward, toward America, where a recession halfway across the world could strip away their last shot at survival. Lebanon doesn't need a war to collapse. It doesn't need a natural disaster. Just one misstep from America. And this fragile framework will come crashing down. This isn't just a story about finance. It's a life-or-death warning for a world leaning far too heavily on a single pillar. If the U.S. buckles, Lebanon won't just default, it will lose everything. Pakistan. when a nuclear power must beg for every dollar. At international conferences, Pakistan remains a country that the world both respects and fears. A nation with nuclear weapons, one of the largest populations in the world, and rising tech potential. But beneath that powerful exterior lies a strangely fragile economy, where every tremor from the U.S. market can cause the entire national structure to sway. Unlike Lebanon, where collapse has become a daily condition, Pakistan stands at the edge. But with trembling legs. Foreign reserves are so low they can only cover a few weeks of imports. Public debt has surpassed the threshold of control. And above all, the country is trapped in a painful dilemma. If it tightens spending as demanded by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, social unrest will explode. But if it keeps pouring money into fuel subsidies and food imports, the national treasury will run dry almost instantly. At that crossroads, the role of the U.S., and specifically its economy, becomes the metronome. Not through high-level meetings, but through seemingly small flows of money, remittances. Nearly 10 million Pakistanis live and work in the U.S., the Middle East, and Europe. Most of them send money back home to support families, pay tuition, buy medicine, or repay microloans. In 2024 alone, remittances from the U.S. to Pakistan reached nearly $3 billion, a figure that the current domestic economy cannot replace. For them, a job in New Jersey can be a lifeline for loved ones in Lahore. But suppose the U.S. enters a recession. Then what happens? American companies start laying off workers. The job market freezes. And immediately, immigrant communities, including Pakistanis, are the first to be cut. No income means no remittances. And like dominoes, Pakistan's banking system starts to lose foreign currency liquidity. The Pakistani rupee, already weak, goes into freefall, dragging fuel, medicine, and essential goods prices up with it day by day. But that's just part of the storm waiting to hit. Pakistan is a net energy importer, meaning it needs dollars to buy oil, coal, and liquefied gas. Without dollars, buses stop running, factories shut down, and electricity becomes a luxury even in major cities like Karachi and Islamabad. What happens when there's no power, but the population keeps growing by over 2 million people a year? When the healthcare system breaks down, but citizens still face flood injuries, disease, and contaminated food. When young people, who make up 60% of the population, are unemployed en masse, while the education and training system isn't strong enough to turn them into a productive workforce? At that point, Pakistan is no longer just Pakistan's problem. An unstable nuclear state is a nightmare for the entire South Asian region, from India and Afghanistan to the Middle East. History has shown, each time Pakistan's economy teeters, extremism surges, separatist groups gain momentum, and migration waves begin crashing toward Europe like an unstoppable tide. So why should the whole world worry about a U.S. recession? Because for Pakistan, just one signal of capital withdrawal from Wall Street, one cutback in pension fund investment from the U.S., or one stricter policy from the Federal Reserve could collapse a financial plan that was already barely holding together. And the scariest thing? It's not the speed of the collapse, it's the helplessness, when both citizens and government know they can't stop the tsunami that's coming. They can only try to stand firm, praying it won't hit this week or next month. But if America sneezes sooner than expected, Pakistan may not have time to prepare. And when that happens, a nation of 240 million people, armed with nuclear weapons, and an economy living off every heartbeat from across the Pacific, will fall. No fanfare, no alarms, just a terrifying silence before a full-blown political and social storm. Argentina. The never-ending symphony of imbalance. In Argentina, one thing has become commonplace: default. 9 times in modern history, this resource-rich country has failed to pay its debts. But imagining that another default would no longer have any serious consequences would be a fatal mistake, because the next time might be the last chance Argentina's economy has to stand back up. This is not a poor country by the traditional definition. Argentina has fertile land, is one of the world's top exporters of soybeans and beef. It holds massive reserves of lithium, the white gold of the electric vehicle era. It has a well-educated population, strong educational infrastructure, and a vibrant culture. But beneath those seemingly favorable conditions lies a harsh truth. Argentina has never learned how to maintain balance. Balance between spending and revenue. Balance between the domestic peso and the US dollars people stash under their mattresses. Balance between free market policies and extreme political intervention. And now, after decades of sliding through patchwork economic models, this country stands before a crisis with no way back, especially if the United States stumbles. 1/3 of Argentina's economy is tied to exports, and the majority of its foreign currency comes from trade with the US and Europe. That's not just revenue, it's financial oxygen that helps the government repay debt, import raw materials, and manage the exchange rate. In a US recession scenario, the first thing to fall would be demand, sending the prices of Argentina's main export goods into a downward spiral. The result? A country already owing more than $45 billion to the IMF, the highest figure in the world, would no longer be able to refinance. Debt maturities would become unpayable. Credit ratings would be downgraded. Investors would flee. And eventually, Argentina would be cut off from the global financial chain. But don't think this is some abstract financial crisis. For Argentinians, each collapse comes with a real price. Supermarkets changing prices 3 times a week. Retirees losing 70% of their income's value in a few months. Small shops refusing to accept pesos, demanding payments in US dollars, which no one has enough of. And in all these consequences, the poor become the first, and often the last, victims. If you walk through Buenos Aires today, you'll still see sunlit cafes, grand theaters, and street corners filled with tango music. But look closer. Many people are having breakfast on credit cards with 120% annual interest rates. Many families are collecting every crumpled old bill to buy a few cold tablets. And most eyes are glued to the USD exchange rate, as if it were the barometer for their very heartbeat. In that context, what would happen if the US enters a recession? First, the value of Argentina's bonds on international markets would plunge, making it impossible for the country to access capital for debt repayment. Second, remittance flows, especially from the Argentine community in Florida and California, would shrink significantly. Third, the peso would collapse another level, triggering a wave of bank withdrawals and a rush to hoard dollars at any cost. And finally, trust would shatter. Because the scariest thing is not just economics, it's psychology. When people lose faith in their national currency, in the government's ability to manage it, in promises that stability is coming soon, that's when everything ends. No reform is effective when citizens withdraw funds, businesses refuse to invest, and young people think only of leaving the country. Argentina is not lacking in resources nor in human capital. But in a globally tense financial environment, just one misstep from the U.S. economy, a misstep that has nothing directly to do with them, would be enough to push this South American country into a prolonged collapse with no exit. And this time, the question is no longer when will they default, but after they do, who will still be willing to help them back up? Egypt. When the pyramids stand on debt and sand. In Egypt, some things seem unchanging. The Nile flows endlessly. The pyramids tower under the desert sky, and a 5,000-year-old civilization still reminds the world of extraordinary resilience. But amid that ancient backdrop, an undeniable reality is taking shape. Egypt's economy is not only fragile, but standing on a base of debt, imports, and a faint hope for inflows from abroad. Egypt doesn't lack potential tourists, strategic trade routes, or a young population. But what the country does lack is the very thing that sustains life in the modern world: financial self-reliance. Egypt's current economic structure resembles a triangle resting on 3 points: tourism, foreign investment, and the Suez Canal. These 3 revenue sources bring in foreign currency, pay off external debt, import food, fuel, and medicine, and keep the wheels of society turning. But all 3 points depend directly on global stability, particularly on the purchasing power, demand, and investment confidence of developed economies, with the U.S. at the center. Now imagine, the U.S. falls into recession. Immediately, tourist numbers from Europe and North America, who make up a large share of visitors to resorts in Sharm el-Sheikh or Luxor, drop sharply. Thousands of tourism workers whose livelihoods rely on warm winters and Western guests are laid off. The service ecosystem collapses in a chain reaction, from drivers and receptionists to souvenir vendors. But that's just the surface. Beneath it, international investors, already wary of Egypt's public debt surpassing 90% of GDP, will instantly freeze their capital plans. Solar power projects get delayed. Development funds pull out of real estate and finance. The domestic stock market, already fragile, plummets. And the Cairo government, once again, returns to the old road: borrowing money to repay debt. Currently, Egypt has borrowed over $165 billion from international financial institutions, with more than $42 billion due in 2025 alone, just to meet maturing debt. But with investment flows drying up, tourism vanishing, and global trade slowing, where will the money come from to pay? And if they can't pay, what happens? The answer: the familiar downward spiral faced by vulnerable nations, devaluing the local currency, cutting subsidies, raising fuel prices, and trading social stability for the next bailout from the IMF. And in Egypt, each time the exchange rate is adjusted, the poor get hit harder than anyone else. When the Egyptian pound loses value, import prices skyrocket. A loaf of bread, the staple food for tens of millions, becomes more expensive by the day. With inflation hovering around 30%, people queue for gas, for sugar, and try to hold on to every pound before it loses more value tomorrow. The Cairo government has signed an $8 billion rescue deal with the IMF, but the cost is clear: eliminating fuel subsidies, limiting public sector hiring, and floating the national currency. Those conditions, while perhaps logical on financial papers, are gasoline on a society already grappling with high unemployment, expensive living costs, and not-so-distant memories of revolutionary waves. Adding to that, the U.S. is not just a major trade partner, but also Egypt's top security donor, giving more than $1 billion annually, mainly to the military and development programs. If a U.S. recession forces budget cuts to international aid, Egypt will be one of the first countries to feel the impact. Now put yourself in the shoes of a family living in a Cairo suburb. You have an office job, paid in a pound that loses value every week. Your child is attending college, but tuition is in U.S. dollars. You buy medicine for your parents from abroad, but the pharmacy has just announced payment must be made in advance, in foreign currency. How long can you manage before everything collapses? And the scariest part isn't sudden collapse. It's the slow but certain erosion. An ancient nation, surviving on every drop of aid and every single tourist ticket, is gradually losing its ability to save itself. If a U.S. recession happens, not even deep, just prolonged, Egypt won't have the time, the fiscal space, or the public trust to survive another landslide. At that point, the pyramids will still stand, but beneath them, the entire modern economy may have already silently crumbled. Zambia. When every ton of copper can't save a sinking economy. In the heart of Africa, where vast mineral mines are seen as the treasure troves of the modern world, Zambia was once expected to rise as an African tiger. Not because of oil or gold, but because of the red metal, copper, the essential material for every power line, electric vehicle, solar battery, and the global green tech dream. But today, this country faces a painful paradox. It has resources, it has demand, but it no longer has the strength to stand, just waiting for an external jolt, like a recession in the U.S., to fall straight into the abyss. More than 70% of Zambia's export revenue comes from copper. The country is the second largest copper producer in Africa, and as such, Zambia's economic fate is not decided in Lusaka, but on the commodity trading floors of New York, London, and Shanghai. When the world needs copper, Zambia survives. But when demand drops, due to recession, consumer crises, or collapsing market confidence, the entire country begins to stop breathing. From 2020 to 2022, Zambia became the first African country to default because of COVID-19, after failing to repay loans totaling $13 billion. Even more concerning, Zambia's debt structure is extremely complex. China, Western private creditors, and multilateral financial institutions. Each has its own conditions, its own repayment schedules, and its own expectations. Debt restructuring has become a political maze, and time is running out. With mounting repayment pressure, Zambia no longer has room to carry out active fiscal policy. The government is forced to cut public spending, delay many infrastructure projects, and refuse to raise wages in the public sector. While food, fuel, and medicine prices continue to soar due to imports priced in U.S. dollars. Now imagine, the U.S. enters a recession. Immediately, global copper prices plunge, as major industries like real estate, automotive, and electronics reduce demand. Copper loses value. Zambia loses its main source of income. That means a revenue shortfall in the budget, the kwacha weakens, and debt repayment ability nearly vanishes. Foreign capital, already drained since the COVID default, will flee completely, because no investor dares to put money into a country that is poor, illiquid, and caught in a commodity trap. But worse than that is the social fallout. More than half of Zambia's population lives below the poverty line. Many rural schools operate thanks to foreign aid, which is now sharply declining. Hospitals, especially in remote areas, rely on imported medicines and equipment, which require USD to purchase. No dollars means no medicine. No medicine means no treatment. This is a collapse that doesn't scream, but crushes. At the same time, food prices, especially for maize, wheat, and cooking oil, soar. Zambia's inflation once exceeded 20% after the pandemic, and still fluctuates at unsafe levels. When incomes don't rise but prices keep climbing, the already thin middle class quickly gets pulled back into poverty. And during all this, the government, which once made real reform efforts, finds itself handcuffed. They floated the national currency, cut subsidies, sought cooperation with the IMF, but all those are long-term solutions, while people are hungry today. The heartbreaking truth is, Zambia tried. They didn't sit waiting for rescue. They reformed. They opened up to investment. But all that effort can still collapse, just because of one misstep by the U.S. economy, where copper prices are influenced, where investment flows are decided, and where the global supply chain takes its cue. In that scenario, Zambia doesn't explode like a bomb. It sinks like a stone. No screaming, no immediate bloody protests, but a silent, steady unraveling from the poorest citizens to public workers waiting on salaries, and eventually the entire administrative apparatus of the state. When an economy lives off resources but can't control who buys them, at what price, or when, that's not sovereignty but dependency wrapped in the illusion of abundance. And if the U.S. goes into recession, Zambia could be the next victim of a world where resources are no longer enough to keep you alive. Ghana. When the currency devalues faster than trust. There was a time when Ghana was seen as a model of modern Africa. A stable democracy, an expanding market, a growing financial services hub in Accra, a capital once dubbed the Shanghai of West Africa. Yet that glow is now just a fading memory under the shadow of debt crisis, runaway inflation, and a financial system being held up by remittances from across the ocean. Unlike Zambia, which survives on red metal, or Egypt, which depends on tourism and aid, Ghana defines itself as a bridge between the world and the continent. But that bridge is shaking violently, and all it takes is a strong wind from Washington, a recession in the U.S. economy, to make it collapse. The storm began in 2022 when Ghana became the first African country post-pandemic to declare default. The CDI lost more than 50% of its value in just 12 months, inflation soared past 54%, and daily living costs danced like a cruel joke to the poor. A bag of rice that cost 30 cedis yesterday is 42 today. Tomorrow, no one dares to ask. Ghana's government then entered the familiar cycle, turning to the IMF. A $3 billion rescue package was approved, but like every International Monetary Fund bailout, the price was austerity. Taxes rose, subsidies were cut, social welfare programs were shortened, and the fragile shield of society, from healthcare to education, began to crack. It seemed like rock bottom, but it wasn't. In 2025, Ghana is still trying to balance on a wire. And what keeps them from falling isn't cocoa prices, isn't gold, but the quiet stream of money from Ghanaians abroad. In 2024, remittances sent to Ghana reached over $4 billion, more than gold exports and nearly equal to cocoa revenue. That's not just money, it's life. It's school fees, hospital bills, seed capital for a hair salon in Kumasi, or a small stall in Tamale. Remittances are the foreign currency pumped into the market to stabilize exchange rates, the hope families cling to as the cedi weakens, the only remaining social policy that people still trust. But then, what no one wants to imagine is drawing near, a recession in the U.S., where hundreds of thousands of Ghanaians are working in service, transportation, healthcare, and construction. If the U.S. falls into recession, the first to be affected will be immigrant labor, the most vulnerable group, working in the lowest margin sectors. When they lose jobs, remittance income drops immediately, and Ghana loses its last driving force for survival. At the same time, American investors, who have been pouring money into real estate, fintech, and infrastructure in Ghana, will pull out to protect their capital. Accra's real estate market, once seen as a bright spot, now faces a freeze due to lack of liquidity. Projects stall, jobs disappear, and the young local stock market plunges. Now, look at everyday life. A high school teacher earns around 1,000 cedis a month, equivalent to less than $100. They pay for imported gas, electricity subsidized in USD, and food, most of which is imported. When the exchange rate spirals out of control, just a few more percentage points in inflation, and that standard of living becomes completely unsustainable. The Ghanaian government, with all its efforts at reform and anti-corruption, is trapped in a painful dilemma. Either continue borrowing to maintain public finance or cut spending and face social unrest. Both paths lead to crisis, unless there's support from the outside. And that support, unfortunately, is faltering. If the U.S. economy catches a cold, Ghana won't just sniffle. Ghana will collapse silently. Small businesses erased, children forced out of school, surgeries postponed for lack of supplies. No war, no coup, just an unstoppable downward slide triggered by the simple fact that Ghanaians in America can no longer send money home on time. A country once praised as the democratic star of West Africa is now balancing on scattered U.S. dollars sent from across the sea. And if a financial storm from the U.S. hits, Ghana, though blameless, will still be one of the first victims swept away. Sri Lanka. When the worst has already happened, but it's still not the end. If any country has faced the most complete and public collapse in the past decade, it's Sri Lanka. The images from 2022 remain vivid in the world's memory. Cars lining up for kilometers, waiting for gas, supermarket shelves empty, citizens climbing over the gates of the presidential palace, and the national leadership forced to flee. An economy paralyzed, a society out of control, and a government stripped bare before its own people. People thought that after such a rock-bottom crash, Sri Lanka would begin to recover, or at least learn how to get back up. And indeed, the country has started the difficult process of rebuilding, renegotiating debt, cutting spending, opening up to the IMF, and seeking new investment sources. But there's one thing that Sri Lankans and the world still can't predict. If the U.S. falls into recession this time, can they stay on their feet again? Because Sri Lanka's problem isn't just a crisis of the past. It's a present that's still as fragile as glass, where even the slightest tremor from the outside, like a slowdown in the U.S. economy, could shatter the entire recovery effort taking shape. Unlike many countries reliant on resources or heavy industry, Sri Lanka survives on tourism, remittances, and foreign investment. Three economic pillars based on sentiment and the financial health of developed nations. When the U.S. is stable, Americans travel more, send more money, and investors are willing to take risks on emerging markets. But when the U.S. struggles, all those financial streams dry up instantly. Before the pandemic, Sri Lanka welcomed more than 2 million international tourists annually, with a large number coming from the U.S. and Europe. Tourism once accounted for nearly 10% of GDP and was one of the most important sources of foreign currency. But just a few weeks of headlines about a U.S. crisis, and plane tickets are canceled, hotel bookings drop, and the entire service chain, from tuk-tuk drivers to beachside cafes, collapses in sequence. But even more dangerous is remittance. Nearly 1.5 million Sri Lankans work abroad, especially in the Gulf states and the U.S. They send money home every month to pay tuition, cover medical costs, and sometimes just to buy rice for the whole village. Remittance is the lifeline. If the U.S. enters a recession, the first wave of unemployment will hit migrant labor, causing hundreds of thousands of families in Sri Lanka to lose their only income source. Even on the calmest days, Sri Lanka is not strong enough to operate independently. Foreign currency must be borrowed, food must be imported, medicine has to wait for shipments from Europe, and fuel mainly comes through deferred payment contracts with China, India, or Arab nations. Once there aren't enough U.S. dollars to pay, essential goods, which had vanished from markets in 2022, will once again become symbols of scarcity and despair. Then there's the burden of debt. Even after partial restructuring, Sri Lanka still owes billions of dollars to China, Japan, and international institutions. These interest payments don't pause during crises. They continue steadily like clockwork. And each payment forces the government to cut further from health, education, or social welfare budgets. Meanwhile, public patience is thinning. People have already taken to the streets once and won't hesitate to do it again if the lights go out, if children go hungry, if gas prices double in a single week. Sri Lanka's politics, already unstable, are now under fresh pressure, a loss of faith in the country's ability to recover. And here lies the cruelest truth. Sri Lanka may do nothing wrong from this point on, yet still collapse just because of a cold wind from the other side of the globe. Not because they didn't try, but because, in today's flat world, a small dependent nation rebuilding from ruins has no right to make mistakes, and even less right to be dragged down by someone else's. A recession in the U.S. may not drown the superpowers, but for Sri Lanka, it could be the final wave, washing away all the hopes just beginning to flicker from nights without power, meals without meat, and dreams that never had the chance to form.